Chair. Today's session on accessibility in the built environment, information and communication, I think is a fundamental matter relating to capacity of individuals and whole groups to exercise their rights under the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. In the Disability Matters Committee, we've tried to foreground the social model understanding of disability, which is relevant for our discussion when we see how poorly designed systems create barriers. While many of the issues we deal with come down to a lack of public services or personal assistance, today we're examining matters that could be resolved through good and inclusive design. And Des, I was struck by the numerous examples you gave of accessibility. It's very impactful, I think, in that regard. My question is for Independent Living Movement Ireland, and as I am, I'm wondering if, as disabled persons organisations or GPOs, what's the level of engagement from government departments and public bodies with you in the development of policies, practices and laws that impact on your members? Article 4 of the UNCRPD requires engagement on legislation and policies relating to persons with disabilities, but from all I've heard, this is rarely adhered to. So I know when it comes to the Assisted Decision Making Act, the most alarming parts of the bill arose from non-consultations with DPOs and people directly affected. But to my understanding, Article 4 should extend to all areas such as transport infrastructure, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, working with you in developing requirements for public transport vehicles, or for all state bodies to seek input in making websites fully accessible. So are government departments and public bodies engaging with you? And related to that, what is your capacity as organisations to carry out that kind of work? What type of no strings attached funding and support should the government be giving to you to allow you to operate independently and to fulfil all those roles? So many of the issues discussed today could be avoided if the government and the state complied with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities.
Thank you, Chair. So I suppose in terms of the level of engagement we would see from government departments, I suppose as I alluded to earlier, we see some really good engagement in some places, and it's very proactive and it's very much an ongoing engagement. In other instances, I suppose we see less engagement, and I think what that partially comes to is this ongoing dance, I think is the way to call it, between the desire on the one hand to centralise and have strong centralised disability policy, but at the other side every department realising this is still for everybody as well. So absolutely we do need space to strategically think about disability, but it's a job for every department as well under the UNCRPD. So I think that is very much a culture piece that still needs to be worked on. The other concern that I would have is that often consultations aren't accessible, and that's why I think these new NDA guidelines are really important. So I've been at round table discussions on autism in very, very loud rooms with no quiet space, with very minimal information in advance, and that just doesn't get the best out of everyone. But not only that, it doesn't show respect for the people who are coming to offer their expertise. What I would say as well is that what we have to think about is disabled people are very often called on to be consulted very, very frequently, and it's not everybody within the disability community is interested in or has the capacity to get involved in these issues. So it's often a small cohort of volunteer advocates who are being invited to a huge amount of meetings, and I think we need to think more about how we can resource and support people to do that. The reality is many people within our community are still living on a disability allowance that, even after the increase in this budget, is offensive. It's not possible to live a decent life on it. So then when people are being asked to travel long distances, there is an expense aspect to that I think needs to be considered as well. I suppose one of the things that I would say is in terms of our own, organisation, what I think we struggle a little bit is we have one policy officer for which we get about half of their salary contributed. That's the sole resourcing we have for our policy work. And every year we have our own work plan. So for example, this year we're preparing a report on access to education in autism, looking specifically at suspension, expulsion and reduced timetables. But one of the challenges is we then have to respond to whatever pops up in the news. So if we think of the schools issue during the summer, the CAMS issue during the summer, and then we also get sudden surprises from our Neuroctis committee, our government department wanting to consult, and all of those opportunities are very welcome, but with one person they're very hard to manage. So I think that is just a challenge. And just to answer, I suppose, the point that Catherine asked me to chip in on, I would very much agree with everything that Catherine said, and I will definitely read the paper. For us, I think the depiction of autistic people in the media is an ongoing challenge. Sometimes it can be really positive, and sometimes we're even seeing positive shifts in popular culture. So if I can even point to the fact that Thomas the Tank Engine is soon to have an autistic train called Bruno the Brake Car, actually voiced by a 9-year-old autistic boy in the UK. And these sort of initiatives are important. But also when you open the media every week, you learn that there's a new cause for autism, or some sensational headline or very negative language used about autism at times, which does stigmatise and does damage. So I think there is a need to have more media education. I think that's very important.
James?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's an opportunity, and thanks Deputy Kearns for such a great question. I think it's an opportunity to actually talk about, the UNCRPD implementation plan. In particular, I think talking about the UNCRPD, we all know and heard about the UNCRPD, but looking to its implementation plan, I think any implementation of that plan needs to be in line with the SMART policy framework, where our policies need to be strategic, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And I think this is a policy framework where the DPO, Disabled Person Organisations Network, which is a lot of the DPOs work together on, and it does, that SMART framework allows us to look at how those policies should be strategic and measurable. So, for example, the NDIS, for example, is a very broad policy with lots of actions, lots of themes, and I think if we can go back to looking at how our policies can be smart in that acronym, and that it could be implemented as well, I think that would be really, really important. And I think that framework as well can align really well with the articles of the UNCRPD, and thematically then be sorted to fit in with all of our intersectionalities as well. So I think it's important that you raise that, Deputy Holly Kearns, around that point, because our policies need to align with them articles of the UNCRPD, and again, to be smart in that approach.
Okay. Des, you have a hand raised.
Briefly, just amplify what James has said in answer to Deputy Kearns, and it has been touched on by Adam. We participate in consultative processes, and as Adam said, some of us come from distances and at some expense, but also meetings are held during the working hour. And if you're fortunate enough to have a job as a disabled person, your employer doesn't take too lightly to you taking time off. So I think what we have to look for an answer to Deputy Kearns is the resourcing of DPOs has to be seen as an integral part of the way forward. We spend nearly $2 billion on service provision that has been analysed to the nth degree in value for money, different reports over decades. It doesn't change. The language around separation changes. And we have what I would call personally, and I'll probably get into some trouble over, an industry around disability that actually continues to, by accident, create a dependency on the industry, rather than liberating us through the type of things we've been talking about this morning. And it can happen by accident, that somehow or other the liberation that has been won gets accidentally sidetracked into other areas by campaigning parents who rightly cry out loud for neglect. And it's appalling that the media should be used because of the ineptitude of people responding, or people deaf deliberately to what's going on, that sometimes the dial of that shifts to a point where there could be a perception that segregated education is where disabled people of all types should go, and not specifically one set of disabled people. It took decades to actually get the Department of Education to agree that children with disabilities would be educated in their local schools rather than in St Mary's, Baldoyle, or the CRC, or the School for the Blind. And there is a danger that somehow in the rightful arguing for a special place for children who might have autism, that could be swept up by planners not thinking or consulting into a generality that segregated education is where people should go. and support of segregated education shift also could mean that in the case of my grandson, who has Down syndrome, the speech therapy services he has in going to an inclusive school is now taken away. And he has, and his family, if they can find it, will have to pay for speech therapy, because if you like, what has been responded to, rightly been responded to as a huge deficit, has swept everything away along with it to respond to it, to the neglect and deficits of policies that could be shifted accidentally behind the chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now go to Tom Coonan's